In 1840, New Orleans was the third largest city in the United States. Its harbor moved more cargo than every American port except New York. By 1860, cotton and sugar passed through its docks at a value of roughly $220 million a year, carried by 3,500 vessels, arriving and departing with the regularity of a machine. The population had climbed from 24,552 in 1810 to 168,675 by 1850, one of the fastest expansions of any city on the continent. Today, New Orleans is known outside Louisiana for one storm. Its population is smaller than it was in 1900. A city that once ranked among the wealthiest ports on earth now measures its history by what the water took, not by what it built. The decline did not begin with any single storm. It began earlier, in the ground the city was standing on. Chapter 1: The Founding and the Bubble. In May of 1718, a French naval officer named Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville stood on a bend of the Mississippi River and gave an order to clear the ground. The bend curved like a blade, a crescent shape carved by the river over centuries, and the ground itself was a natural levee, high enough, barely, to keep a settlement above the surrounding swamp. It sat 100 miles upstream from the Gulf of Mexico, reachable two ways: up the river mouth, the long route, or across a short portage from Lake Pontchartrain, the route that mattered more. Bienville named the place for Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, regent of France, and a man who would never see it. The crescent gave the city a nickname that would outlast the regency, outlast France's ownership of it entirely, outlast every flag that flew over it after. It called itself, and still calls itself, the Crescent City. The colony's actual founder was not a soldier standing on a riverbank. It was a Scottish financier in Paris named John Law, and his instrument was a firm called the Company of the Indies. The company held a full monopoly on Louisiana's trade. Every pelt, every barrel, every ounce of the fortune investors were told waited in the swamp. Law sold shares across Europe on that promise. Not a colony, an actual empire, one that would make Paris rich, the way Peru had made Madrid rich. The money came in ahead of the proof. It always does. In 1719, the company shipped roughly 1,000 people across the Atlantic to build the town's levees: convicts, contract laborers, men with no say in the matter. They dug in heat the company's Paris office had no name for. Disease moved through the work crews the way it moved through every low, wet colonial outpost in that era, fast once it took hold, and indifferent to who it took. Many of the 1,000 did not live to see the levees finished. The levees got finished anyway. By November of 1721, a census taker walked the settlement and counted heads. The number came to 470, 277 of them white, 172 enslaved Africans, 21 enslaved Native Americans, 470 people, on a strip of mud financed by shares traded in a city none of them would ever visit. It was not a city yet. It was a ledger entry with buildings on it. And then, within a year, the ledger stopped balancing. Law's Company of the Indies collapsed in Paris in one of the first great speculative crashes in European history, its shares falling from fantastic heights to nothing in a matter of months. Fortunes vanished on paper the way they had appeared on paper, fast and without much ceremony, but the town on the Mississippi did not vanish with them. The money that built it was gone. The mud it was built on was still there. September of 1722 brought Louisiana's first well-documented hurricane, and it did what the young settlement's defenses were not built to survive. The storm destroyed the church and the hospital, took 30 houses outright, and washed away every wharf standing on the river. New Orleans, 4 years old, had lost its money, and now its buildings in the same 12 months. An engineer named Adrien de Poger looked at the wreckage and saw an opening. The old settlement had grown without a plan. Now there was no settlement left to argue with him. He laid out a grid, 6 blocks by 11, and named its streets for the French royal family that had financed none of it and would visit none of it. Bourbon, Royal, Dauphine, Conti. The levees he built to hold the river back stood 3 feet high. They failed, with some regularity, almost immediately. The town survived the bubble, survived the storm, survived its own levees. It would go on standing on that crescent of mud for 4 decades under the flag that built it. Then, in a matter that not even the men living in New Orleans would learn about for almost a year, the King of France gave the whole colony away. Chapter 2. The Flags That Changed. The paper that changes New Orleans is signed in November of 1762 in a hunting lodge outside Paris, and almost no one in Louisiana knows it exists. Louis XV gives the colony to his cousin Charles III of Spain. Not a sale, an actual gift, wrapped inside the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and sealed before the ink on France's larger defeat in the 7 Years' War has even dried. The transfer is kept secret for 2 years. Colonists keep flying the French flag, keep trading in French livres, keep addressing their letters to Versailles, unaware that the crown they answer to has already changed hands an ocean away. When the truth reaches New Orleans in 1764, it arrives not as an announcement, but as a rumor, then a confirmation, then a slow-burning grievance that will take 6 years to boil over. Spain does not hurry to claim its prize. Not until 1766 does the first Spanish governor, Antonio de Ulloa, step off a ship into a city that never asked for him and does not intend to keep him. He arrives with fewer than 100 soldiers, no funds to bribe the local council, and no patience for Creole merchants who have spent 3 generations building trade networks with France, with Saint-Domingue, with anyone but Madrid. The colonists organize, petition, and finally revolt. In October of 1768, they force Ulloa back onto a ship and out of the mouth of the Mississippi, the only successful rebellion against a European crown anywhere in the Americas before 1776. It lasts 18 months, a strange and unrepeated interval in which New Orleans answers to no crown at all. Spain does not forget it. Spain answers in August of 1769, and it answers with Alejandro O'Reilly. He arrives with 2,000 troops crowded onto 24 ships, more soldiers than New Orleans has adult men, and the city surrenders without a fight. O'Reilly spends 2 months gathering names, filing charges, building a case in Spanish courts against men who had, months earlier, believed themselves liberators, patriots, the founders of something new. In October, he executes 6 of the rebellion's leaders by firing squad in the same Place d'Armes where they had once celebrated. The nickname follows him for the rest of his life and outlives him by centuries. Bloody O'Reilly. Louisiana belongs to Spain now, in fact, as well as on paper, and it will stay that way for 3 decades. And then, in 1800, Spain hands the colony back. Secretly again, this time to Napoleon's France, in a retrocession most Louisianans will not learn about until it is already old news. Napoleon does not want a swamp on the Gulf of Mexico. He wants cash for a war in Europe. On April 30th, 1803 in Paris, American diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe signed their names to a purchase price of $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre for 828,000 square miles. A single signature that doubles the size of the United States before the ink dries. The paperwork takes months to catch up with the ground. On December 20th, 1803, in the Place d'Armes, the same square where O'Reilly's firing squad once stood, the tricolor comes down and the stars and stripes go up over a city of roughly 10,000 people. No shot is fired. No soldier objects. No delegation votes. New Orleans has now changed hands 4 times in 41 years. French, Spanish, French again, American, without its own residents casting a single deciding vote. And most of them have never set foot in the country that just adopted them, do not speak its language, and do not yet trust its currency. It is American now. It is not yet rich. The plantations upriver still measure their harvest by how fast a keelboat can be poled against the current, which is to say, slowly, at the mercy of men with poles and ropes and the patience to fight a river for weeks at a time. That problem has a solution, and in 8 years, it will come down the Mississippi under its own power, carrying a woman 8 months pregnant and a fortune no one in New Orleans has priced yet. Chapter 3: The Engine and the Trade. The New Orleans leaves Pittsburgh in October 1811, a low black hull under smoke, and everyone who watches it go assumes it will not survive the trip. Nicholas Roosevelt built it, Robert Fulton financed it. Lydia Latrobe Roosevelt, 8 months pregnant, rides it down the Ohio, and then the Mississippi, through an autumn when the New Madrid earthquakes are tearing the riverbed apart beneath her, past collapsing banks, and a comet overhead that rivermen are already calling a bad omen. She gives birth somewhere along the way. The boat does not sink. It reaches New Orleans in January 1812, the first steamboat ever to run these waters. And what it proves is not that a boat can survive an earthquake. It proves that the Mississippi can run 2 directions at once. That reversal changes the arithmetic of everything upstream. Cotton grown in Natchez, sugar boiled in Plaquemines, tobacco cured in Kentucky. None of it any longer depends on a keelboat crew fighting the current for a month at a stretch. It moves downriver fast now, and it moves back up faster, and there is exactly one port between Pittsburgh and the Gulf that all of it has to pass through. Not a port, the port. New Orleans stops being a place goods pass through and becomes the place goods must pass through. And a city built on that leverage does not stay small for long. Neither does the trade that grows up beside it. In 1808, the federal government bans the import of enslaved people from overseas, and the effect on New Orleans is immediate and specific. The market does not close. It relocates. The buying and selling continues, only now the supply moves overland and downriver from Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas instead of arriving by ship from Africa, and New Orleans becomes the largest domestic slave market in the country. The rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel runs public sales for 2 decades under its painted dome. The firm of Isaac Franklin and John Armfield alone sells more than 100 people in a single stretch of transactions, $56,000 changing hands for human beings. Entered into the same ledgers that recorded cotton futures and sugar contracts. Historians at the historic New Orleans collection put the total sold through the city's markets across the antebellum decades at roughly 135,000 people. The estimate is theirs. The arithmetic behind it is the city's. The city absorbs all of it the way it absorbs everything else that arrives by river, by growing. 24,552 people live in New Orleans in 1810. By 1820, the count is 41,351. By 1830, 49,826. By 1840, it has more than doubled again to 102,193, and that figure makes it the 3rd largest city in the United States, ahead of Boston, behind only New York and Baltimore. Not a river town anymore, not a French garrison with a cotton press and a customs house, an American metropolis assembled in 3 decades on a floodplain, financed by cotton, sugar, and human beings. Delivered by a boat that came down from Pittsburgh under its own power and never really stopped arriving. By 1850, the count stands at 168,675, one of the 2 or 3 busiest ports in the entire country, Ships and flatboats and steamboats stacked 3 deep along the levee for a mile at a stretch. The growth has come the way growth comes to American port cities when the money arrives faster than the planning does. Fast, dense, low-lying, packed onto drained swamp with drainage that was never built to match it. 168,000 people pressed into streets a few feet above the waterline with no sewer system built to hold them. Chapter 4. The Summer of 1853. The first death is recorded on May 28th. A single line in a clerk's ledger filed under fever, cause unremarked. It will not be the last entry made in ignorance. The disease travels the way it always travels in this latitude, through the cisterns, the rain barrels, the standing gutters behind every house, in a city built on drained swamp with no sewers to carry the water off. And by mid-June, it has moved past the docks and into the crowded immigrant lodging houses along the river, 3 families to a room, where a fever needs no more than a night to cross from one bed to the next. The newspapers call it a mild season. The newspapers have advertising contracts with the shipping houses, and shipping houses do not pay to have their port called diseased. They keep calling it mild for 8 weeks. Editors who depend on cotton factors and steamship agents for their revenue print notices of brisk trade and fair weather, while the burial registers fill in a different hand entirely, and by the time the papers finally use the word epidemic, July 22nd, the concession arrives late enough to be almost decorative. More than 1,000 people are already dead. Not sick, not suspected. Dead and in the ground, weeks before the city's own press permits itself to say so in print. The week that follows breaks whatever restraint was left. 429 deaths between July 23rd and July 30th, a single week. A number the health board records without adjective because no adjective is required. Coffins run out before the week does. The dead are carried instead to mass trenches on the outskirts of the city, dug and refilled by chain gangs working through the heat in relays, and the trenches take the names the way the ledgers had. Plainly, one after another, immigrant and infant and stevedore laid down in the same turned earth. By the time the fever breaks with the first cool nights in October, the season's toll stands close to 8,000, 8% of the entire city, gone between May and October, in a place that had counted 168,000 souls that spring. The fever does not choose evenly. It falls on the newly arrived, the Irish and German immigrants packed into the boarding houses nearest the standing water, bodies with no prior exposure to carry them through. At a rate of 7.4% of the city's white population dead by autumn. Among the enslaved black population, the toll is 0.2%. Most of them had already survived the disease once, in childhood, in earlier outbreaks that had passed through the same streets and left them immune in a way the new arrivals from Hamburg and Cork could not be. The epidemic, in the end, keeps its own ledger of who this city considers expendable and who it does not, and the answer is written less in intention than in who was standing nearest the water when the fever came. Through all of it, the city does not close. The docks stay open through July, through the week of 429, through October, because the sugar crop does not wait on a health board, and neither does the money. Chapter 5. The Crescendo. The city recovers the way it always recovers, by counting. Louisiana's sugar harvest, which wavered through the fever years, reaches 449,000 hogsheads in 1853, a record that will not be beaten again before the war. Prices climb faster than the harvest does. By 1858, a single hogshead of raw sugar sells for $69 on the New Orleans market, and the state that once imported cane sugar from Cuba and Santo Domingo now supplies roughly a quarter of all the sugar traded anywhere on Earth. Not a regional surplus, an actual monopoly, built row by row on land drained from cypress swamp within living memory. Planters who buried relatives that same summer of fever plant again by October, because the frost that kills a standing cane crop is a nearer threat than yellowjack, and because the ledgers do not carry a line item for grief. By 1860, the arithmetic of the port has outgrown any single figure meant to hold it. Cotton and sugar together move through the wharves at a value of roughly $220 million a year, carried by some 3,500 vessels arriving and clearing across a single 12-month cycle. Ships out of Liverpool, Le Havre, New York, Boston, and Baltimore tie up 3 and 4 deep along a levee, with no room left for a fifth, their masts crowding the sky above the rooftops like a second, temporary forest planted every season and cut down every season after. Cotton factors work out of marble-fronted offices on Carondelet Street, sugar brokers out of counting houses on Magazine, and between the two trades, the city holds more banking capital than any port south of Philadelphia. Per capita, income generated inside the city limits ranks among the very highest of any American city, a fact that sits oddly beside the shanties of the 3rd District and the auction blocks 2 streets from the cathedral. New Orleans is not merely prosperous, it is for a handful of years one of the richest cities on the continent. Picture the Vieux Carré on an evening in the 1850s. Gaslight only recently arrived at the corners. On the Place d'Armes stands the Cabildo, rebuilt in Spanish stucco and barrel tile, after fires took the old wooden version twice, in 1788 and again in 1794. Beside it, St. Louis Cathedral lifts a rebuilt tower toward the river, consecrated in December of 1851, after the previous one partially collapsed under its own ambition. Along the same square, Baroness Michaela Almonester de Pontalba has spent more than $300,000 of her own money on twin rows of red brick apartments, and more than once she has climbed the scaffolding herself, in trousers, to correct a mason's line. A few blocks upriver, the newly annexed Faubourg Livaudet, briefly its own city of Lafayette before New Orleans absorbed it in 1852, fills block by block with Greek Revival mansions, their columns paid for in cotton bales, and sugar hogsheads rather than inherited stone. The streets underneath all of it are the same streets Adrien de Pouget laid out after the hurricane of 1722. Bourbon, Royal, Dauphine, Conti, still bent into their original crescent along the levee, now carrying carriage wheels instead of cart tracks and gaslight instead of tallow. Somewhere between the Cabildo's tile roof and the cathedral's new tower, on this one evening, the entire history of the city stands at once, and none of it looks temporary. None of this happens by accident, and none of it happens by charity. A cotton bale grown on credit in the Mississippi Hill Country passes through a dozen hands in New Orleans before it reaches a mill in Manchester. A hogshead of sugar owes a fee to a broker, a drayman, a wharfinger, and a bank before it ever clears the bar at the river's mouth. The whole machinery depends on one plain fact nobody on Royal Street spends much time considering, that the river stays open, end to end, under a single flag, from the cold water of Minnesota to the warm water of the Gulf, without interruption and without a toll booth in between. Somewhere north of the city, in the small print of that same year's newspapers, men have begun arguing about what happens if that stops being true. It does not reach the dinner parties on the Rue Royale. Not yet. Chapter 6. The Pivot. For 6 nights running, mortar boats below Forts Jackson and St. Philip drop shell after shell onto the 2 brick works guarding the mouth of the Mississippi, and for 6 nights the forts do not fall. 13,000 rounds go into the mud and the masonry. The forts keep firing back. On the 7th night, April 24th, Farragut stops waiting for them to break and goes around them instead. 17 ships running north past the guns in the dark, past the fire rafts, past the chain barrier strung across the channel, past a river lit orange, on both banks by the exchange. 2 vessels are lost. The rest come through. By the time the sun is up, the forts are still standing behind him, and it no longer matters what they do. What happens next takes less than a week. The next afternoon, his ships anchor off New Orleans itself, guns trained on a city with no army left inside it. General Lovell's garrison has already marched north, taking the muskets and leaving the cotton. 4 days later, on April the 28th, word reaches the fleet that the forts have surrendered. And not to a landing party. The garrisons, out of food and out of reason to keep dying for a position the war has already gone around, turn on their own officers and raise the white flag themselves. Not a siege ending, an actual collapse from within. New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest city and its busiest port, changes hands without a single shell landing on Canal Street. On May 1st, General Benjamin Butler comes ashore with 15,000 troops and takes formal possession. A curfew, a garrison in the custom house, a provost marshal's office, the ordinary furniture of a conquered town. It holds 2 weeks without incident. Then on May 15th, Butler issues General Order No. 28. Any woman who insults, by word or gesture, an officer or soldier of the United States is to be treated and held liable as a woman plying her avocation for gain. A prostitute, in the plain, reading the order intends, and everyone in the city reads it that way immediately. The order reaches the floor of Parliament within the month, denounced by members who have never set foot in Louisiana and will not need to. He does not withdraw the order, nor does he apologize for it or soften its language. Not then, and not at any later point in a long post-war political career spent explaining a great many other things. For the rest of the war, he is Beast Butler, in every newspaper south of the Mason-Dixon line, and in a fair number north of it, a name that outlives his uniform, his committee chairmanships, and very nearly the century. The number that outlasts the name is the one sitting in the Custom House ledgers. In 1860, the last full year before the guns, cotton moving through the port of New Orleans is worth something close to $110 million. Under the blockade that follows the occupation, that figure falls by close to 95%. Not a decline, an amputation. The loss of Port City does not talk itself out of by the next planting season. The war has 3 more years left to run. What it costs the city does not stop accumulating when the shooting does. Chapter 7. The Long Slide. The census does not know how to measure a wound. It only counts heads, and by that measure, New Orleans spends the last 3 decades of the 19th century recovering. The city rebuilds its wharves, reopens its cotton presses, restocks its warehouses with the freight of a nation stitching itself back together. Streets that stood empty under occupation fill again with drays and stevedores, and the particular commerce of a river town remembering its old habits. Population climbs. By 1870, the city counts 191,418 residents. By 1900, it counts 287,104. On paper, growth. In practice, something closer to treading water, while the current moves elsewhere. A railroad answers it, completed in 1869. A year the ledgers do not flag as significant because nothing about it looks like a catastrophe at the time. The transcontinental line does not touch New Orleans. It does not need to. Freight bound from the Pacific coast to the eastern markets can now cross the continent on rails, bypassing the river, bypassing the Gulf, bypassing the slow work of loading a steamboat and floating cargo 1,000 miles to a port that used to be unavoidable. The Mississippi does not stop flowing. It simply stops being the only road east. And at the river's mouth, where a harbor once dredged and tended with the attention a city gives its own throat now sits neglected, silt accumulates year over year, a slow closing of a door nobody remembers voting to shut. The arithmetic of rank tells the story the population figures hide. In 1840, New Orleans is the 3rd largest city in the United States, behind only New York and Baltimore, a river capital outranking Boston, outranking Philadelphia's rivals, a city that assumes its own permanence the way a young man assumes his health. By 1900, it is 12th, not a collapse anyone announces from a balcony, a demotion delivered in the quiet arithmetic of other cities simply growing faster, Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, cities built on rail junctions and lake trade and the new grammar of American commerce, that no longer runs through a Louisiana delta. New Orleans is not shrinking. It is being outpaced, which is its own erasure, slower and less visible, and in the end, no less final. Then in 1878, the old enemy returns. Yellow fever has haunted the city before, but the epidemic that arrives that summer moves through New Orleans with a thoroughness that outstrips memory. More than 24,000 cases, over 4,000 dead, entire households marked and abandoned within weeks. Doctors still do not know a mosquito carries it. They blame miasma, filth, the swamp air itself, and treat a biological certainty as a moral failing of the city's sanitation. The railroads that have already begun to strip New Orleans of its old commercial monopoly owe the fever nothing. They run through drier country, through towns without a delta's standing water, immune to an enemy the river city cannot shake. New Orleans fights an 18th century war while competing in a 19th century economy. It loses ground on both fronts at once. By the century's final years, the pattern is set, and it does not need dramatizing. A port city no longer central to the nation's freight. A population growing in absolute terms while its relative weight diminishes year by year. An old disease still capable of emptying its streets when the new industries never break stride. But south of the city, in the marshland along the river's lower reaches, surveyors and speculators have already begun taking a different interest in the ground itself, not in what moves across it this time, but in what lies underneath. The 20th century is arriving with its own commodity, and it will not travel by rail at all. Chapter 8. The Inventory of What Remains. The petroleum age reaches the river's edge in the new century. Refineries and storage tanks rising where indigo and sugar once stood, and the city's fortunes climb even as its standing among American cities keeps sliding. The oil does not need the port the way cotton once needed it. It moves through pipelines that do not stop to be counted on a wharf. Still, the population grows, decade over decade, drawn by wages that do not ask a man's history before paying him. In 1960, the census takers finish their count, and the number they record is 627,525, the highest population New Orleans has ever held, before that year or since. No year afterward equals it. No year afterward comes close. The decades that follow empty the city of the people who can most easily leave it. School desegregation reaches Louisiana in the 1960s, and white families depart for Jefferson Parish and St. Bernard Parish in numbers that do not reverse, taking with them the tax base that had financed the city's streets and its schools and its levees. What remains grows steadily more black, steadily poorer relative to the suburbs ringing it, a city hollowing from the inside while its footprint holds its shape. The bowl does not change size. It only holds fewer of the people who once filled it, and less of what used to keep it running. On the morning of August 29, 2005, a hurricane makes landfall near Barras, Louisiana. As a Category 3 storm, its sustained winds near 125 miles an hour. Its name is Katrina, and by the time the water finishes moving through the city, the storm's name will not need explaining to anyone in the country. The levees fail outright rather than overtopping or eroding gradually in more than half a dozen places along the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and the Industrial Canal. Walls built to hold back a lake instead opening onto the streets behind them. Roughly 80% of the city floods. Water finds attics, finds rooftops, finds the highway overpasses, where people wait for boats that do not come as fast as the water rises. Across the Gulf Coast, the storm kills 1,392 people. It displaces roughly 1.5 million more across 3 states, the largest displacement of Americans in the nation's history, larger than the Dust Bowl, larger than anything the century before it produced. The bill comes to an estimated $125 billion, the costliest hurricane the country has ever recorded. New Orleans, before the storm, holds roughly 484,674 residents. Within a year, it holds an estimated 230,000, less than half a city, still standing on the same ground. By 2020, the population has climbed back to 383,997. Recovery of a kind, but a recovery that reaches only 79% of the 1960 peak, a number still below where the city stood the year before the water came. What survives calls itself a city built on hospitality now more than commerce. More than 19 million visitors arrive in 2024 alone, spending over $10 billion on the version of New Orleans that postcards sell. The balconies, the brass, the food, the ghost tours. The port complex remains among the busiest in the country, oil and grain and containers still moving through it the way freight once moved through it a century and a half earlier. Poverty runs close to a third higher than the national rate. The tourists come for a city that, in the strictest sense, does not entirely exist. Only about 25 buildings in the French Quarter date to the French colonial period the neighborhood is named for. Almost everything photographed as historic New Orleans was rebuilt by Spain. After the fires of 1788 and 1794, leveled the original wooden town and Spanish money replaced it in brick and stucco and iron. St. Louis Cathedral, its parish founded in 1720, is older than the buildings around it and remains among the oldest continuously used Catholic cathedrals in the country. A genuine relic standing among careful reproductions, and few of the visitors photographing it know the difference, or need to. The river still makes the same crescent turn it made when the first surveyors mapped it, still leans hardest against the ground the city was built to occupy. The natural levee is still there, low and unhurried, the same ridge of silt that once stood 3 feet above the water and was never quite tall enough. Engineers have built higher walls since 2005, concrete instead of raised earth, but they follow the same curve the river drew for itself before anyone thought to improve on it. On a still morning, the water moves past the quarter, the way it has always moved past it, brown and patient, indifferent to what stands on either bank. It does not rise. It does not need to. It has already shown more than once that it only has to wait.